Blair Athol or Manic Moor or some of these. Fettercairn is one. I mean, God, I wonder what people who work at Fettercairn must feel like when you see some of the stuff that's written about their whiskey, you know?
I mean, and that's one thing, you know, that sort of sat down with people like Dave from Boutique and Sam. There are no bad whiskies out there. There might be one or two that are hard to swallow sometimes, but there are no bad whiskies. It's just that it doesn't necessarily suit an individual's palate. That's the way I look at things. They're all made with passion. Somebody's obviously liked them at some point to put it out there. So for anybody to attack a whiskey personally, you're attacking the people, which again brings us back to one of the most important things about making whiskey: the people that make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of expand on that as well, I was allowed out, I think in August, went up to Scotland.
You've been out.
Went round a few of the new distilleries. So I went around McNain and Razzie and Ardnamurchan and Harris. And looking at those distilleries, it's fascinating to see how important from that kind of cultural terroir, if you want to use that term, or certainly from that idea of place, the social responsibility and the social effect that a distillery has on a community, because all of these distilleries in remote places, you know, and, you know, Razzie and Harris have had the shit kicked out of them, you know, from a social point of view for, you know, 100+ years. The same for Ardnamurchan, the same for McNain and Morven. The way in which a distillery suddenly provides focus, a focal point for a community, and also employment for a community. Torre Vague, I would add into that as well. And allowing young people to actually move back into the area or not move away from the area. And speaking to the folk who are working there, the local people who are working there and coming back into the area who've been working Calmac ferries or offshore or in the local Tesco or whatever. And saying, you know, a young generation being able to stay in the place that they want to stay in, and the distillery being this, as I said, focal point for a community. The ripples that has across the community is absolutely extraordinary. And that's something else that's also forgotten. You know, it's not just the distillery, it's who is employed by the distillery, and then the ancillary trades, which then come as part and parcel of a distillery being there. So that's what really excites me about a lot of the new distilleries which are starting up in Scotland, because especially those ones in more remote communities, because they are so important to an evolution of the country. So yeah, it's something that also is a really exciting thing to write about.
Yeah, I see you laughing there, Sam. What do you think?
Well, my mind immediately, when Dave was saying the ripples of a community, went to the first images I saw of whiskey making, which is those classic woodcuts, or that Highland still. I think I have it in the other room, and the Highland still, that Landseer painting. It's never one person distilling, and that sense of community. You can even see a smokestack in the distance, which implies a wider community in that particular painting. There's the dog. There's maybe someone who's a minister or an alchemist who's there as well. It's a whole community event. I think that's so vital and central to this elixir that obviously brings us together, welcomed me warmly years ago. And whiskey is that connection to people in that community that just seems so natural to the social drink.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at something like, going back to Johnny Walker as a blend, obviously we mentioned a few minutes ago that people say it's only rubbish whiskies going into blends, but yet the blended market is the biggest market for whiskey in the world anyway, and you've got a whiskey there that's, it's decades old, millennia, and the history of the whiskies going into there, and some of the whiskies that go into those blends are there's some of the best whiskies out there, and it's, to me, almost the blended whiskey is like a family.
Well, there's a lot of assholes who hate the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Idiots.
Yeah, but I mean, if we go to you, Nick, with Johnny Walker, and we talk about the whiskies and the blends that are going in there, and the amount of people that are involved that make Johnny Walker what it is.
Well, not quite sure what the quoted figure is at the moment, but it's between 35 and 40 individual whiskies go into each blend of of Johnny Walker, and you don't have to be a mathematical genius to know that Diageo doesn't have that many distilleries. So it's not just Diageo distilleries that are involved. It's a much broader range than that. And of course, most blends are the same. 25, 30, 35 whiskies in them. I don't know how many whiskies Sam puts in his blends. He might tell us in a moment. But that's Dave was talking about this footprint of whiskey, and we're very proud in Diageo to talk about the footprint that we have in terms of distilling and the responsibility that goes with that. But when you think of a blended whiskey, it's going to reach into every part of Scotland, And the other thing I would say is that when people talk about malts and blends, I think there seems to be a misunderstanding that the single malt whiskies that we have today have been shaped by blenders. They've been shaped and in fact almost designed by blenders, and the style of whiskey that you would have got 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 150 years ago was very, very different. And it's been shaped and changed by blenders in the face of what people want to drink. Okay. And certainly in the 19th century, the very last people who wanted to think about what people wanted to drink were the distillers, particularly the Highland distillers, who were a trenchant, backward-looking bunch, and they had to be sort of dragged into the 20th century in the end by blending houses. And believe me, people talk about terroir and styles of whiskey. Well, when they realized that people in the 1890s, early 1900s really wanted lighter styles of whiskey, in the end, these distillers couldn't move fast enough to change the styles of whiskey they were making. And they did that by using different grain. So the Highland distillers started using a lot of imported grain rather than local grain, which even 70 years after 1820 was still pretty shitty. It came late. The farmers didn't invest in technology to dry the grain. I mean, it was just trying to distill with Scottish barley was almost impossible. So you change the style of grain you were using, change the way you distilled, purifiers started to come in to lighten the spirit. And some people famously, as a quote, I'm not sure if it's in the book or not, one company, not Johnny Walker, who were desperately trying to change the whiskey style, said, yeah, maybe we shouldn't leave so much sherry in the casks before we put the whiskey in. So, all sorts of stuff changes, but it's blenders, and it's blenders following consumer demand that mean that Lagavulin is like it is today, and Ardbeg is like it is today, and even Balvenie and Glenfiddich to an extent, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, are you going to tell us what's in the World Whiskey Blend, Sam?
I can't remember breakfast, man. There's no way I can remember what the fuck's in that.
I'm going to say, we've always got to talk about the World Whiskey Blend because Dave never shuts up about it. That's Dave Worthington, obviously not Dave. But yeah, I'm surprised he hasn't come up with a bottle already. But yeah, I mean, going back to the history then, Dave, we know there's always an argument between who was the first to make whiskey. Was it the Irish? Was it the Scots? The Scots obviously taught the Irish and things like that. So, what's your quick take on that one?
Quick take on who was first to make whiskey.
Well, sort of more about the history, really. We'll backstep to the point of we know there's always going to be the argument whether it was the Scots or the whiskey. Does it really matter anyway? But
no, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, the first record of worts being distilled is in the Canterbury Tales, which is 100 years before Friar John Caw allegedly started distilling. So I mean, the knowledge of distillation was out there. Knowledge of distillation been out there for hundreds of years before that. So I don't think it matters. And I think what fascinates me is the development of whiskey as a social drink. From medicinal purposes and alchemical purposes in its very early days. That moment where spirits in general cease being something that you take because you have a sore head to something you take because you want to have a sore head, and that shift, that social shift in drinking is what fascinates me the most. And, that's coming 15th century, 15th, 16th century. And then you begin to see the development of, Ushkaba, as a flavored spirit, but as a way of taking those kind of fundamentals of medicinal herbal tinctures into acceptable flavors for your family, your clan, your environment, etc., etc. And it picks up with what Nick was saying. I think the great distillers from the word go were picking flavors to suit themselves and also their communities. And that really fascinates me. I love kind of fossicking about in the old alchemy records and finding out. I was reading an amazing book or rereading an amazing book by Patrick McGovern, who's an archaeologist who's traced beverages back to Neolithic times, and seeing what, through pollen traces and et cetera, in ancient beakers, what was being used and what these things might have tasted like. In fact, Willie Grant, I remember, kind of did a mead a few years back. So, this kind of knowledge of using location and crafting a spirit, whether that was whiskey or whatever, to suit the population and reflect what was growing around you. It's not new, it's really, really old. And that's what excites me more about whiskey than anything else, I think, in terms of history.
Yeah. I mean, what's your take on that, Nick?
Pollinated beakers. That's not my not my special subject. I think that shift to, if you will, popular drinking is a really interesting one, and it's quite complex. And I always tend to think it has something to do with the dissolution of the monasteries and the sort of, stuff. Oh, Dave's shaking his head. I happen to think that, Dave. So I'll stick that one with me. But I think popular drinking, really, I mean, there's two sorts of drinking. There's subsistence drinking, and then there's drinking which is sort of more conspicuous consumption drinking, and that comes with money and wealth and growth of economy, which is why and with leisure time as well. And that's why really I think the whiskey that we know about, we think about, is all really sort of not even during John Walker's time in the 1820s and 1830s. It's more like 1850s, 60s, 70s and beyond. And I think it's interesting then to think about what people drink, because my conception had been that people mostly drank whiskey, and if they didn't have a bottle of soda water, then they would have certainly just had something to dilute it. And writing the book, I came to realize that actually the most popular, respectable way of drinking whiskey, not just in Scotland, but in England, was drinking it in toddies in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, through to the 1890s, really, when soda becomes soda water, and mineral waters of one sort or another become far more available. And so I hadn't really realized the pervasiveness of toddy drinking, the rituals around toddy drinking, and the paraphernalia that went with toddy drinking, the memory of which seems to have disappeared, and it's not written about much either. I mean, it's as if it never happened. And the other thing about toddy drinking, of course, is that the whiskey was very different. So toddy whiskies were heavy and oily and smoky. You start, Sam's having one already. You start having, start trying to put soda water into that style of whiskey, and it's not going to taste too good. So as you have that transition from drinking toddies, hot, very simple, none of your fancy spices and things. It's simply dark, probably not very well refined sugar, lemon if you were lucky, but not in most Glaswegian pubs, and hot water, and just either mix it in a bowl for people to serve themselves, or everyone mixing their own toddy to their own tastes and specifications. Once you move on from that to whiskey and soda, you're going to have a different sort of whiskey, and that's why all these changes happen in the 1880s and particularly 1890s and early 1900s.
Is it not a different class of people though enjoying those two drinks as an example, Nick?
Really?
But we're talking about this is sort of broad middle class drinking. You're either going to be drinking in a dram shop, a sort of bottom of the heap, if you will, or it's going to be middle class drinking at home. So what did you do in Scotland on a Sunday? You sat at home and you made toddies, and that's why there was just such this domestic paraphernalia around making it. In the same way, there was all the domestic paraphernalia around tea drinking and stuff like that. It was a real ritual and a social interaction that was going on. Or you would do it in restaurants and hotels. It's a great quote from Alexander Walker, who used to stay at the there's what we can now call the St Pancras Hotel, Midland Hotel, by St Pancras Station, when he came down to London, which he did frequently. And he talks about like going to the theatre, which he did a lot. And he likes to come back from the theatre and drink my whiskey hot. Drink my whiskey hot. That was how he talked about it. So it's it's very much the sort of broad, respectable face of whiskey drinking, both out of home and in home, Sam.
Well, the also thing, it's been fascinating to following all of that, and the revelations in the book, Nick, I think are fantastic, especially about the styles of whiskey and that fundamental shift. But if you go back in history and look at that kind of social drinking history of whiskey, any time it's been popular, it was either flavored or it was drunk long. It was in a whiskey punch, or then the whiskey punch became single serve, which became the toddy. Then it was the highball, etc., etc. So, one of the things I've kind of been ranting about for a whole number of years is, this idea that this concept that whiskey had to be drunk and you could only drink whiskey neat. It's actually a relatively new phenomenon. Any point where whiskey's been popular, it has been lengthened, or it's been flavored, or it's been drunk in various different ways. And again, it's not this kind of binary thing that we were talking about earlier on. It's not one or the other. It is an option. You can drink whiskey in a number of different ways, and it's something that we've kind of forgotten and are beginning to rediscover, which is a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing, that two things that have kind of come out of there. Obviously, yeah, if you buy your whiskey, drink it how the hell you want, because it's your drink. And I mean, I know you're quite an advocate. Hopefully, I get the whiskey right with Lag 16 and Coke.
Lagavulin 16 Coke works. Yeah, it's a great drink, but it doesn't mean it's the only way you drink Lagavulin 16. It's just, it is an option. It's an option. And, I was when I was doing the whiskey manual, I tasted everything with 5 different mixers, and Lagavulin was the last Isle of whiskey I did, and none of the others had worked with Coke. I wasn't particularly surprised with that, really. And then boom, it happened, and it was the last one. I was thinking, I'm just a bit pissed, and so I made another one and took it upstairs and gave it to my wife, and she went, "That's a really nice drink." And she went, "Okay, it is actually." Help, and there's almost been stand-up fights in classes where I began to suggest that maybe this was an option for people, not an edict coming from on high, because that's been the great problem that whiskey has had for generations, is that here are the rules and you have to abide by the rules, and if you don't, you should be casting out into outer darkness. Just drink this stuff.
But Dave,
but I also think, just before Sam, just before it comes in, I think we also do a disservice to ourselves and to the people who say, "How should I drink whiskey?" by saying, "Drink it any way you want," and then kind of walking away, because that hasn't answered the question. That's kind of said, they're kind of going, well, "Give us a clue," So
what experience do you want?
Give us some options as to how to drink. Which is why, something like World Whiskey Blend, Sam, you said, seamlessly moving into brand promotion, it was so fascinating with all the different highballs and everything you were doing.
Thanks, Dave. That was stolen from you, and I give you credit at every opportunity, because all of your serves are on the back. So that's all you. The way the world drinks whiskey.
Do you want to just show us the front of that bottle? Because none of us have ever seen that before.
Hey, you invite him. You invite Dave.
Oh, we don't invite him. He just comes along. We